I spent 40 years of my life teaching people how to spot danger, how to read a room, how to know when a lie is breathing right in front of them. But nothing prepared me for the moment I walked into my own home and felt the air shift. Not from fear, from recognition. Someone had been inside, and whoever it was, they wanted me to notice. The first thing I saw was the old family photo frame moved just an inch. Not knocked, not bumped, placed. Then the filing drawer I always locked, now slightly open, like someone ran out of time. The smell of unfamiliar cologne lingering in the hall. And worst of all, the small brass key I hid behind, the clock, gone. That key opened my private safe, and inside that safe was everything someone would need to erase me. As I stood there, trying to steady my breath, my elderly neighbor Marjorie Hayes rushed across the yard and grabbed my wrist. Her voice trembled when she whispered, "Harold, I saw who entered your house last night, and if I'm right, you're going to learn something at midnight that will change everything you believe about your family." I looked at her, stunned, and for the first time in my life, I felt old, not weak, just painfully aware of how quickly everything familiar can turn into threat. So I made a decision. I packed a suitcase, told my son I was going away for a long drive, smiled, hugged him, pretended nothing was wrong. But I didn't leave town. No, I crossed the street, climbed into the attic of an abandoned cabin, and pointed my binoculars straight at my own front door, ready to watch the people I trusted most walk into a trap they thought they set for me. And what I saw over the next few days, the lies, the visitors, the midnight meetings, the betrayal woven quietly through my own bloodline, will stay with me until my last breath. Before we go deeper, and trust me, what comes later in this story is something you will not see coming. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the moment everything explodes wide open. Because somewhere in this story, there's a secret so cruel, so unexpected, that even now, I'm still not sure I've recovered from it. And it all started the night I pretended to go on vacation. When people talk about growing old, they mention gray hair, sore knees, or the way time steals our energy little by little. But they never talk about the loneliness that sneaks into the quiet corners of a house. How a man can live 72 years, fill a home with memories, and still feel the walls closing in when trust begins to rot from the inside. My name is Harold Green. For decades, I served as sheriff in El Paso County. I raised my son, taught him to fish in mountain streams, fixed his bicycle on summer mornings, watched him graduate with pride swelling in my chest. I buried my wife 10 years ago, and I've lived in this old 2-story wooden house in Colorado Springs ever since. It's creaky, drafty, in the winter, smells like pine and old books, but it has always been mine, safe, familiar, predictable. Or so I believed. That evening, after discovering the strange disturbances in my study, I tried to calm myself. Maybe I misplaced things. Maybe I forgot to lock the drawer. Maybe age was finally catching up with me in ways I didn't want to admit. But deep in my bones, I knew better. 40 years in law enforcement trained me to understand patterns. Nothing in that room happened by accident. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my hands. The same hands that once held arrest warrants, shook grieving parents' shoulders, wrote final reports on cases darker than night. Now they trembled, not from fear, but from the cold realization that someone I loved might be behind this. My son Brian had moved back into my house last spring. He said he and his wife Lydia needed time to regroup financially. At first, I welcomed them. The house had been too quiet for too long. Seeing my son walk down the stairs in the morning brought back a softness I hadn't felt since my wife passed. But the more they stayed, the more something felt off. Lydia, with her perfect hair and her sharp perfume, always acted like she was auditioning for some invisible audience. She spoke sweetly, but her eyes drifted around my house as if memorizing every corner. She asked questions no daughter-in-law should ever ask. Where do you keep your savings documents, Harold? Do you have life insurance? Has your will been updated recently? She'd say it casually, like discussing recipes or weather forecasts, but I felt the weight under every word. And Brian, my son, he wasn't the boy I raised anymore. He used to laugh easily, tell me everything, sit with me on the porch, and talk about life. Now, he spent most nights in the basement office. I let him use, door closed, voice hushed, when he answered his phone. Sometimes he avoided looking at me altogether. Sometimes he watched me too closely, as if studying my reactions. Once I caught him standing in my study doorway late at night. He said he was checking the thermostat, but the thermostat was at the other end of the hall. I brushed it off. We make excuses for the people we love, sometimes for far too long. The real warning came at dinner, the night after the incident in my study. We sat at the table, Brian on my left, Lydia across from him, the sound of cutlery echoing faintly off the wooden walls. Lydia had cooked. Her cooking always tasted like someone followed a recipe without any love in it. Brian cleared his throat. Dad, have you ever thought about updating your will? The fork froze halfway to my mouth. It wasn't the question itself. It was the way he asked it, flat, rehearsed, almost mechanical. And the way Lydia leaned forward, eyes bright with a kind of hunger I recognized only too well. I had seen that look in criminals who believed they were close to getting away with something. I set my fork down slowly. Why do you ask? Brian's eyes flickered to Lydia, then back to his plate. Just, planning ahead. Planning ahead. Such an innocent phrase. Yet it sliced through the air like a blade. Lydia smiled all sugary sweetness. We only worry about you, Harold. Living alone can be difficult at your age. Having documents in order prevents confusion. Confusion. There it was, the seed of a future accusation. A way to claim I wasn't thinking clearly if something ever went wrong. I chewed slowly, watching them. Seeing them not as family, not as people I loved, but as individuals whose motives no longer aligned with mine. Brian's hands were shaking. Lydia's were not. After dinner, I pretended to watch television while observing their reflections in the dark window, their whispers, their glances, their tension. The house that once sheltered me now felt like a stage, and I was no longer sure which role I was supposed to play. All I knew was this: something was happening here, something deliberate, something dangerous. And whatever it was coming from inside my own family. That night, long after Brian and Lydia had gone upstairs, I sat alone in the living room, listening to the house breathe. Old wooden houses make many sounds, settling walls, shifting pipes, the occasional pop of cooling timber. But that night, every sound felt like a warning. Every creak echoed a truth I didn't want to face. My son wasn't the boy I raised. My daughter-in-law wasn't the woman she pretended to be. And my home wasn't safe anymore. I turned the television off and let the silence settle. I needed clarity, a plan, a way to confirm what my instincts already whispered. Back when I was sheriff, I learned one thing that never failed me. If you want to know what people are hiding, you let them think you're gone. The idea formed slowly, but once it rooted itself, it grew like wildfire. I would leave, or rather pretend to. The next morning, I made a show of stirring oatmeal on the stove, sighing tiredly, rubbing my temples, as if the world had worn me down. Brian came into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Lydia followed shortly after, bright and alert, in a way that suggested she'd been awake for hours. I waited until Lydia poured her coffee before I spoke. "I'm thinking of taking a little trip." She froze mid-stir, then recovered with a practiced smile. "A trip? Where to, Harold?" "Just driving. Maybe down to Santa Fe. Take a few days. Clear my head." Brian blinked at me, surprised. "Today," I shrugged, folding the act around me like an old coat. "Yeah, I'm not getting any younger." Thought maybe the desert air would help. His relief was almost immediate, too immediate. "That sounds great, Dad. You should do it." "Really?" Lydia touched my shoulder, gentle, sympathetic to rehearsed. "Travel is good at your age. Helps keep the mind active." There it was again. The hint, the insinuation, the subtle implication that I wasn't quite myself. I forced a grateful smile. "Thanks, sweetheart. Don't worry about the house. You two just enjoy the quiet." Those words landed exactly where I wanted them to. After breakfast, I made sure they saw me packing. Suitcase on the bed, old hiking boots, a couple of maps, a jacket. Enough noise and movement to convince them that I was truly leaving. But in the bottom of that suitcase, beneath the shirts and socks, I slid something they would not have expected. My old sheriff's binoculars, a small notebook, a handheld recorder, a camera with a long lens. Tools of the trade, tools for truth. At noon, I wheeled the suitcase out to my old pickup truck. Brian followed, insisting he help. He lifted the bag into the truck bed with an enthusiasm that stung more than I cared to admit. "Take your time, Dad. Stay as long as you need." I leaned in and hugged him. His body stiffened just for a second before he hugged me back. Lydia kissed my cheek. "Drive safe, Harold. Call us when you get there." I promised I would. Then I got in the truck and pulled out of the driveway. I watched them in the rearview mirror. As I drove away, they stood side by side, smiling, waving, their bodies relaxed, as if my absence had loosened some secret tension inside them. But the moment I turned the corner, everything changed. Because I didn't drive south toward New Mexico. I drove 5 blocks north into a quiet neighborhood where houses sat empty, seasonal, or up for sale. I parked behind an abandoned cabin I'd noticed weeks before. A property bank owned with windows coated in dust. No electricity. No tenants. Perfect. I slipped through a loose side panel near the deck, careful not to leave obvious disturbances. Inside, the air smelled like wood rot in old insulation. But it had one advantage: a perfect line of sight straight across to my house. I climbed into the attic, pushing aside a stack of forgotten paint cans, and positioned myself near the small, triangular window at the peak. From there, I could see everything: the driveway, the porch, the downstairs windows, even the faint outlines of silhouettes moving inside. I unfolded my notebook, raised my binoculars, and waited. The first thing I saw was Lydia closing the blinds the moment they thought I was gone. Not gently, not casually, but with urgency, with purpose. 20 minutes later, Brian carried a cardboard box from the garage into the house. Then another, and another. I wrote it all down. Every movement, every pattern, every unexplained action. The sun dipped behind the pines. The house glowed with warm lights, while the cabin around me sat cold and dark. Hours passed, and then just after 10 p.m., a black SUV pulled into my driveway. Someone stepped out, not a neighbor, Not a friend, a stranger. Tall, weathered suit, a leather briefcase in hand. He walked to my front door, and my son, my own son, opened it before the man even knocked. That told me everything. I steadied my breathing, lifted the binoculars again. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't old age. This was betrayal beginning to bloom, and midnight was still hours away. From the attic of the abandoned cabin, the world outside looked distant, cold, and strangely small. But my house, my own home, sat center stage, every window glowing like a lantern in the night. It felt like I was watching a life that wasn't mine anymore, a life someone else had reached into and quietly begun dismantling piece by piece. I wrote down the time, 10:14 p.m. The stranger with the briefcase had just entered. A faint light flickered in my living room. Shadows crossed the curtains, 3 silhouettes moving back and forth. Brian's tall frame, Lydia's sharp stance, and the stranger. I adjusted the binoculars slowly, carefully. Years of training steadied my hands. Even now, old bones obeyed when the mind demanded it. Through the thin gap in the curtains, I caught my first real glimpse of the stranger. A man in his 40s, clean cut, a crisp suit that didn't match the late hour, and a seriousness in his movements that made my stomach tighten. Not a friend, not a casual visitor. This was business, serious business. I watched Brian gesture nervously as they moved toward the dining table. He kept rubbing the back of his neck, his old tell when he was hiding something. I had seen that same gesture when he lied about breaking a window at 12 years old. Same gesture when he tried to cover up failing a college class he was too ashamed to explain. Some habits never change. The reasons behind them do. Lydia, on the other hand, moved with purpose. Steady, confident, almost triumphant. She placed a red folder on the table. My red folder. The one from my study safe. My jaw locked. I forced myself not to blink, not to breathe too deeply. The stranger opened the folder, examining the papers with deliberate focus, held one page up to the light as though checking watermark authenticity. It wasn't just curiosity. He was verifying something valuable, something stolen. I wrote it down, page by page, movement by movement. This wasn't guesswork anymore. It was evidence. At 10:32 p.m., Lydia took out a pen and pointed at a document. The stranger nodded. Brian nodded. I saw their silhouettes lean in. I strained to see more, but their bodies blocked most of the view. Still, the motions were unmistakable. Signing, passing papers, exchanging documents. A financial transaction. A secret one. I lowered the binoculars for a moment, letting reality settle into my bones. When I swallowed, my throat burned. They were selling something. Something connected to my property. Something that required my signature, or the illusion of one. My chest tightened. They weren't just planning to take my home. They were already in the process. I lifted the binoculars again and caught a clearer angle as Lydia moved to the side. The stranger slid a stack of papers back into his briefcase. He shook Brian's hand, then Lydia's. Deals sealed with handshakes are the oldest kind of betrayal. When he left the house, Brian walked him out the front door, murmuring something too low for me to hear. But I didn't need to hear it. I'd heard enough over a lifetime to recognize guilty gratitude when I saw it. The stranger stepped into the SUV and drove off. Brian lingered on the porch a moment, staring into the night, his breath visible in the cool air. And then he smiled. A small, self-satisfied smile. That smile cut deeper than any accusation. Lydia joined him. She slipped her arm around his waist. said something that made him nod, then laugh quietly. A laugh in the night that hollowed me out. They stood there together, my family unaware that just across the street, I watched everything crumble. When they finally went back inside, shutting the door behind them, the house darkened room by room until only the hallway light remained. I sat in that dusty attic for nearly an hour, staring into the darkness where my home stood. Questions formed like knots tightening in my mind. Were they behind the missing documents in my study? Were they intercepting my mail? Did they steal that brass key? Or was someone else helping them? The stranger, what was his role? An agent, a broker, a lawyer. I replayed every expression I'd seen through the window, every nervous shift in Brian's posture, every calculated glance from Lydia. This wasn't desperation. This was coordination, a plan, a full-fledged operation with multiple moving parts, all aimed at me. And then it hit me cold and undeniable. They weren't just scheming behind my back. They were orchestrating a financial takeover, one that required my assets, my property, my identity. And at the center of it all, my own son stood willingly. I closed my notebook fingers stiff from the cold intention. This was no longer suspicion, no longer doubt. It was happening. And if midnight held the truth Marjorie warned me about, then the worst wasn't what I'd seen tonight. The worst was still ahead. I barely slept that night in the dusty attic of the abandoned cabin. The floorboards were cold, the air thin, and every creak echoed louder in the dark. But none of that mattered. My mind was far louder than the silence around me. I kept replaying the scene from earlier. The briefcase, the handshake, the red folder, the signatures. But something about the stranger's confidence stuck with me. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't unsure. He wasn't acting like a man doing something illegal. He was acting like a man who believed he had the right to be there. That detail gnawed at me. Because if he felt that comfortable walking into my house at night, then he wasn't just helping Brian and Lydia. He was someone bigger, someone with power, someone who thought I was already out of the picture. The next morning, after the sun rose over the pine trees, I left the cabin quietly and drove back to the fringes of my neighborhood. I parked behind a cluster of trees where no one could see the truck. Then I walked slow and steady, circling the block until I reached Marjorie's house. The elderly woman was sitting on her porch, knitting as if she'd been waiting for me all morning. She didn't look surprised at all. She just set her yarn aside and said one sentence that froze the breath in my lungs. "Harold, did they bring the banker last night?" I stared at her. "The banker," she nodded, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "The one in the gray suit. He's been here twice this week. Met with Brian both times. The first time, Brian walked him through your yard, showed him property lines, just like realtors do." My pulse thudded painfully. "Marjorie, why didn't you tell me sooner?" She gave me a look only elderly women can give, half sympathy, half scolding motherhood. Because until last night, I didn't know how far it had gone. But once I saw that red folder, I understood. She stood slowly, leaning on her cane, and motioned for me to follow her inside. Her living room smelled like lilac candles and old magazines. She walked to her coffee table, opened a drawer, and pulled out a notebook. Pages filled with dates, times, descriptions. "Harold, I've seen people change when money enters the picture," she said quietly. "But what your son is doing, this isn't just greed. There's someone else involved. Someone directing." She flipped to a page from last week. 2 men came on Monday. Not the banker. Different. One of them looked like security. The other one looked like a lawyer. They didn't go inside your home. They waited in the driveway until Lydia came out. She talked to them for almost 10 minutes. The room felt colder suddenly. Why would Lydia be speaking to a lawyer? Marjorie looked at me with eyes that had seen far too much. You know why. I sat heavily in the armchair across from her. What else did you see? She hesitated, then turned the page. On Thursday, Lydia left the house with a stack of envelopes, returned without them. Brian spent the rest of that night shredding papers in the garage. I leaned back, my breath leaving me in one long exhale. The scope of the betrayal was widening right before my eyes. It wasn't just forged documents. It wasn't just secret meetings. It wasn't even just a planned financial takeover. They were eliminating trails, destroying records, coordinating with outside people who didn't belong anywhere near my life. I rubbed my face with my hands. Marjorie, this is too organized, too calculated. Someone's guiding them. She nodded slowly. That banker last night, that wasn't just any banker. I recognized him. I froze. You know him. She swallowed hard. He's from Aspen Ridge Financial. They're not a small bank, Harold. They handle high-value estates, trust transitions, asset liquidation, things that require signatures. The word hit me like a blow. Signatures. Plural. Not just mine. What are you saying, Marjorie? She leaned closer, lowering her voice. I think they told him you were already declared unfit. Or worse, that you wouldn't be around much longer. The room spun. I gripped the armrest until my knuckles turned white. That's impossible, I whispered. Brian would never. But the sentence died before it left my mouth, because deep down, the truth had already begun to surface. Marjorie placed a gentle hand on my arm. Harold, I saw a medical examiner at your house 2 days ago. I blinked. A what? She nodded firmly. Not a doctor. A medical examiner. He was in a county vehicle. He talked to Lydia briefly, then left. I wrote down the plate number. She handed me the note. My chest tightened, breath shallow. Medical examiners don't visit living people. Not unless there's paperwork involving death incapacitation or anticipated decline. My voice trembled when I finally spoke. Marjorie, what on earth are they doing? She looked at me with a fear I hadn't seen in her eyes before. Harold, they're not just planning to steal your home. They're preparing a case. A full one. With financial advisors, legal contacts, medical sign-offs. They're building a world where you already disappeared. Her final words landed like a hammer. And the worst part is, they've been planning it much longer than you think. I sat there in the silence of her living room, heart pounding, feeling the walls close in around me. Because the enemy wasn't just in my house anymore. The enemy had a network, a structure, a plan so deep that I had only scratched the surface. And Midnight's truth was still waiting. I left Marjorie's house with the cold mountain air slicing through me, sharper than any winter wind. Her words echoed in my head with every step. They're building a world where you already disappeared. I thought I knew the extent of their betrayal. I thought Lydia was the mastermind, pulling Brian along like a puppet. But as I walked back toward the abandoned cabin, every instinct honed from decades in law enforcement kept telling me there was more, much more. And I was about to find out just how deep the rot went. Later that afternoon, I returned to the attic with a thermos of coffee and waited. From my vantage point, the house looked deceptively peaceful. A warm, wooden home where a family should be safe, where laughter should come from the kitchen, where shared memories should fill the walls. Instead, it had become the headquarters of a scheme so rotten I could taste bitterness just watching it. At 3:07 p.m., Brian came home alone. He didn't walk into the house right away. He sat in the car with the engine still running, head down, talking on the phone. I gripped the binoculars. Brian rarely spoke on the phone outside, but today he was gesturing, pacing, agitated, in a way I hadn't seen since he was a kid trying to explain away trouble. When his voice finally reached me through the cracked window of the attic, one sentence cut through the air. I told you. I'll get the money by the end of the month. Just give me time. I froze. Money. What money? He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. I don't care what Lydia promised you. My deal is separate. Separate. The word hit the center of my chest. Separate deal. Brian wasn't just following Lydia's plan. Brian had his own. He ran a hand through his hair, anxiety pouring off him in waves. I'm doing everything I can. The house is the biggest asset. Once it's sold, I'm clear. I'll pay you back. I swear. Clear pay him back. I felt the attic tilt around me as the truth sank in. Brian was in trouble. Serious trouble. Debt loans. Gambling. Something dangerous enough that he saw stealing from his own father as the solution. He kept talking pacing now. I can't go to jail for this. I won't. Just let me finish the sale. If she wants her cut, fine. I'll deal with her later. Her, Lydia. Brian wasn't following her lead. He was using her. She was using him. Two snakes circling the same prize, each pretending cooperation while sharpening their own fangs. A partnership built on deceit, but not loyalty, and I unwittingly was the prize. Brian ended the call abruptly and slammed the car door, shoulders slumped, face pale with fear. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't see malice in him. I saw desperation, but desperation doesn't justify betrayal. I kept watching. Inside the house, Brian went straight to the guest room, his temporary office, and pulled out more papers. He didn't even bother closing the blinds. Through the window, I watched him spread documents across the desk. Bank notices, delinquent statements, collection warnings. My heart sank. He was drowning financially. Then he took out a separate folder, black, unmarked, thicker than the others. He opened it, and even from a distance, I recognized the top sheet, a loan agreement, with a name I hadn't heard in 20 years. Frank Calderon, not a banker, not a lender, a loan shark. One of the worst from Denver. Years ago, we'd nearly arrested him for extortion before the case collapsed. Brian had gone to him. What kind of hole had my son dug himself into? I watched him rub his temples, breathing hard, panic shaking through his shoulders. And then another twist I didn't expect. Brian pulled out a voicemail message on speaker. The muffled voice reached even the attic where I sat. Brian, you're late again. My patience is running thin. If you don't come through this time, you know how this ends. Your father's house better sell. You're running out of chances. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just betrayal. This was coercion, threat, danger. Brian wasn't just greedy. He was trapped. But then, just as a sliver of sympathy crept into my chest, everything changed. Because Brian said something that drained every drop of pity I had left. Yeah. Don't worry. The old man barely knows what day it is. He won't put up a fight. He thinks he's going on some peaceful old man trip. Pathetic. Pathetic. The word stung. Then he laughed, short, bitter, ugly. After this is done, he can go to a nursing home for all I care. Lydia wants him gone completely. But I don't care how. I just need the house. That's when sympathy died. Cold and final. Brian wasn't protecting his family. He wasn't making a desperate mistake. He was willing to throw me away, his own father, to fix a life he broke himself. He had chosen his path, not out of fear, but convenience. Greed wrapped in desperation. Desperation sharpened by greed. And while Lydia plotted her own escape with the proceeds from the house, Brian had his own debt-driven plan running in parallel. 2 betrayals, 2 agendas, both orbiting the same man they hoped wouldn't live long enough to stop them. I closed my notebook slowly, because now the game had changed. Lydia wasn't the only enemy. Brian wasn't a manipulated son. He was a co-conspirator, and I was no longer fighting one plot. I was fighting 2. When Brian's cruel laughter faded and the house went quiet again, I sat in the attic of the abandoned cabin with my notebook in my lap, staring at the scribbled lines that documented the worst hours of my life. I had seen criminals lie. I had seen desperate men steal. But nothing compared to hearing my own son say he'd throw me away for convenience. The kind of betrayal that doesn't just hurt, it rewires something in you. I breathed, slowly counted to 10, letting the old instinct, the one forged over decades in uniform, take over. Emotion makes mistakes. Evidence wins wars. And I wasn't losing this one. Not to Lydia, not to Brian, not to the banker, not to whatever shadowy threat Frank Calderon dangled over my son. This time, I was the one setting the traps. I rose from the creaky attic floor and returned to the truck under dawn's pale light, the kind that makes the world look washed out hollow, like it hasn't decided what to be yet. Perfect time to start fighting back. I drove straight to a small diner on the edge of town, not because I needed breakfast, but because it opened at 5 a.m. and had a corner booth with an outlet. I ordered a coffee I wouldn't drink and opened my notebook, my phone, my recorder. Step 1 was simple: document everything. Formally, cleanly, in a way no lawyer, banker, or criminal could twist. I played back the recording of Brian's phone call, paused, repeated, wrote the exact words. I'll get the money by the end of the month. My deal is separate. The old man barely knows what day it is. Nursing home after this. Every line, every insult, every confession. Then I added timestamps, exact observation notes, patterns of behavior, witness corroboration from Marjorie. It felt cold, methodical, clinical. But sometimes justice requires cold hands. By 8:30 a.m., I had a full timeline. Every suspicious event, every unexplained visitor, every movement of the banker, the lawyer, the examiner, the envelopes, the red folder. I looked at it all spread across the table and felt something settle deep inside me, something steady and unshakable. This wasn't a family issue anymore. This wasn't even a betrayal. This was an organized conspiracy. And conspiracies collapse under evidence. At 9, I made my next move. The first call I placed was to an old friend, attorney Samuel Price. We hadn't spoken in 8 years, but he picked up on the second ring. Harold, you still alive? Alive and in need of legal firepower. He heard the steel in my voice and didn't joke again. What happened? I told him everything, not as a heartbroken father, but as a former sheriff reporting a case. He listened without interrupting, then exhaled sharply. Harold, this isn't elder neglect. This is financial predation, felony charges, at multiple levels. That's why I'm calling you. You're gathering evidence every second. He paused. Good. Then listen closely. You need proof of 3 things: intent, opportunity, and action. I have all 3. Then you're almost ready. But you still need the knockout blow, the forged signature. That's your hammer. Get it. When I hung up the phone, I knew exactly what had to come next. I drove back toward my neighborhood parking, 2 blocks away. The house was quiet, Lydia's SUV gone. Brian, presumably at work or handling whatever mess he'd created. Perfect. I slipped into the backyard, using the tall pine tree for cover, and retrieved the spare key I'd buried years ago under the old bird bath. They didn't know about this one. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner, Lydia's doing. My steps were careful, deliberate, every sense tuned like a wire pulled tight. The guest room, Brian's makeshift office, looked exactly as I'd last seen it through the window. But inside, I could see the storm he'd tried to hide. Stacks of bills, collection letters, A warning from Calderon's people. And in the center of the desk, the black folder, the one with the loan agreement. But that wasn't the prize. The real prize was in the drawer beneath it. A red folder, my red folder stuffed thick with property documents, my financial statements, insurance forms. And wedged between them, a power of attorney. Dated, stamped, signed. Signed by me, except the signature wasn't mine. Close, shockingly close, but I saw differences immediately. The loop of the H curved wrong. The pressure dips in the G didn't match my natural handwriting. And the ink had a shine that didn't belong to a 6-month-old signature. I held the page against the light, my old habit, and saw the faintest trembling under the forged lines. Someone traced this, sloppily, desperately. This was my knockout blow. The document that could send both Brian and Lydia to prison. But the more I looked, the more something else stood out. Another signature. Below mine, Lydia's. And next to hers, a third one, the banker. He wasn't just verifying. He was complicit. This wasn't a scheme involving 2 greedy spouses. This was a financial coalition. And they had just handed me the weapon to destroy them all. Footsteps suddenly echoed down the hall. I froze. Brian, home early. I slid the papers into my jacket, closed the drawer silently, and ducked behind the open closet door just as the doorknob turned. Brian entered with a phone pressed to his ear, pacing anxiously. No, listen. Once the house sells, I'm free. I don't care what Lydia wants. My plan is separate. This is my money. Separate again. His words weren't a knife anymore. They were a blessing, because every one of them sealed his fate. When he finally left the room, slamming the door behind him, I slipped quietly out the back and vanished into the alley. Heart pounding. Evidence secured. I wasn't the hunted old man they imagined. I was about to become the force they never saw coming. And now, for the first time since this nightmare began, the advantage was mine. The morning of the signing felt strangely calm, the kind of stillness right before a storm breaks open the sky. I woke before sunrise, dressed in the same navy suit I wore the day Brian graduated from the academy, and buttoned the jacket with hands steady as stone. Today wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about truth. Raw, ugly, undeniable truth. By 9 a.m., I sat in attorney Samuel Price's office, reviewing the final packets of evidence. The forged signature, the recordings, the debt agreement tied to Frank Calderon's network, the banker's signature proving collusion, the financial advisor's fabricated evaluation notes. Samuel glanced across the desk at me. You understand, he said softly. Once we walk in there, there's no going back. This ends whatever you had with Brian. I nodded. That ended when he decided to sell my life out from under me. At 1:45, we drove to the escrow building, a glass structure that always felt too bright, too transparent for the secrets that got negotiated inside. My heart beat with a rhythm I recognized from my early days in uniform, the moment before breaching a door. We took the elevator up, 2nd floor, conference room 4B. And there they were, Lydia professionally, dressed cool, unreadable, checking her reflection in her tablet, as if preparing for a photo shoot. Brian, jittery, foot-tapping eyes, darting hands, shaking slightly. The banker composed, but pale. The financial advisor, the escrow officer arranging documents, and at the far end, the buyer, an older gentleman reading through the contract pages. My entrance froze all of them. Brian's jaw locked. Lydia's lips parted in a brief, shocked inhale. The banker swallowed like he'd been punched. The advisor dropped his pen. Samuel placed a hand on my shoulder. Nice and steady, Harold. Let the truth do the damage. I walked in, calmly set my leather briefcase on the table and spoke in the same controlled voice I'd used in interrogation rooms. "Good afternoon. I'm here regarding the property sale scheduled for today." Lydia stood steadied herself. "Harold, you shouldn't be here. You're confused. You—" "Sit down, Lydia." She did. I turned to the escrow officer. "Before a single page is signed, I'm entering formal objection based on fraud, forgery, and financial coercion." The room went dead still. Samuel opened the briefcase and placed the red folder in front of the officer. "Exhibits A through F." He said, "Evidence of a conspiracy to illegally transfer property belonging to Mr. Harold Whitaker." The banker's voice cracked. "Conspiracy? That's absurd. I verified." "You verified nothing," I interrupted, pulling out the forged power of attorney. "You signed off on a document that never crossed my hands." I slid the page toward the buyer. He compared signatures calmly, then looked up with a frown. "This isn't the same handwriting as the trust documents. And that," Samuel said, "is where this deal ends." Lydia exhaled sharply. "Harold, stop this. You did sign it. You just don't remember. Your memory—" "Let's listen to your own words," I said. I tapped my phone, and her voice filled the room. "If he challenges anything, we cite cognitive decline. He won't know." Then Brian's voice, "3 more days, then we're free." The echo of their betrayal clung to the glass walls like smoke. Brian stood abruptly. "This is being taken out of context." I raised a hand. "No, this is context." I laid out the second document, the debt contract signed with Calderon's associate. The buyer leaned forward. "Is this a criminal loan?" Brian's face went white. Samuel added, "He planned to use Mr. Whitaker's home sale funds to repay it, without consent." The banker pushed back his chair. "I was misled. You were complicit," I said quietly. Then I placed the final piece, the forged signature, under the ceiling light. The shaky tracing lines glowed like cracks in ice. "Look at that," I said. "The loop on the H, the pressure marks, the ink age. You forged my name. You tried to take everything I built. And you did it while sleeping under my roof." Brian's voice broke. "You don't get it. I was drowning. I needed a way out." "You don't steal your way out of drowning," I said. "You swim." Lydia crossed her arms. "So what now? You'll ruin us." "No," I replied softly. "You ruined yourselves." The buyer closed his folder. "I won't be part of this. This sale is void." The escrow officer nodded. "Effective immediately." Samuel turned to the banker and advisor. "I'll be contacting the state board regarding your involvement." They both sat in stunned silence. "But Brian—" He sagged into his chair, shoulders collapsing like a man whose last lie had finally run out of breath. "Dad, please," he whispered. I didn't think you'd fight back." I held his gaze. "That was your third mistake." "Third." I leaned closer. "First, trusting criminals. Second, underestimating me. Third, forgetting that the truth always keeps receipts." No one spoke. The meeting ended with a single, sharp sentence from Samuel. "Gentlemen, the sale is canceled, and criminal proceedings begin today." As I walked out of the room, leaving Brian and Lydia staring at the ruins of their scheme, I felt the storm inside me finally go quiet. The war was over. Truth had won. But this wasn't the end of the story, because in the silence of that hallway, I realized something chilling. I still didn't know who Calderon really wanted, Brian or me. And that truth, the one still hiding in the shadows, was the part of the story I hadn't uncovered yet, the part waiting in the dark for its moment to strike. When I stepped out of that building, the Arizona sun felt different on my skin. Not warmer, not brighter, just real, like the light had finally caught up to the truth I'd been running from. The fight was over. The scheming, the watching, the late-night fear, all of it behind me now. But the quiet that followed wasn't victory. It was something heavier, something honest. I sat in my truck, for a long moment, hands resting on the wheel, listening to the soft hum of the engine. And I let myself feel the one thing I'd been avoiding from the very beginning. Loss. Not the loss of a house, not the loss of money, but the loss of a bond I thought could never break. You raise a child with love. You believe you've poured enough goodness into them to build a lifetime. But sometimes, life teaches you a hard truth. Blood may tie you together, but choices decide who truly stands with you. Still, even through betrayal, something unexpected happened. Something I didn't see coming. I found people who stood with me when family didn't. Neighbors who watched when I couldn't. Professionals who stepped in when I needed help. Strangers who believed my truth more fiercely than the people I once trusted most. Maybe healing doesn't always come from those who hurt you. Maybe it comes from the ones who show up anyway. When I drove home that evening, the house felt peaceful again. Quiet. Mine. I brewed a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the desert sky turn from blue to gold to a soft lavender. And for the first time in a long while, I breathed without that weight in my chest. I won't pretend everything is forgiven. Some betrayals carve too deep. Some scars stay where they are. But I'm learning slowly, carefully, that healing isn't about erasing pain. It's about refusing to let pain define you. It's about standing back up, protecting your dignity, choosing peace over bitterness, choosing yourself even when others don't. So if you've ever been hurt by someone who should have loved you most, if you've ever felt alone in your own home, or wondered how family could turn so cold, hear this. You are not alone. Your story matters. Your healing matters. And sometimes, the life that begins after everything breaks is the one that finally lets you breathe. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journey, because there are more stories coming, stories you'll want to hear all the way to the end.